I think we're ready to go. Welcome, everyone, to this Cardiff Book Talk event. I'm Anna Mercer. I'm a lecturer in English Literature at Cardiff University, and I'm delighted to welcome you to Book Talk's 10th anniversary season, and also our second ever online session. I can see now that we have 225 participants in the Zoom webinar today. That's really exciting. This is actually the biggest book talk ever, so we've just broken a record. I know we have people joining us from all over the world from looking at the registration list, and that's really exciting too. We have a really great dedicated audience in Cardiff, and now with this new format, people can join us from Cardiff, but also from further afield, and that's really exciting. Thank you for being here tonight. At Book Talk, our expert speakers address a piece of classic or contemporary fiction from the perspective of their own specialism. And today, the focus of the three talks and then our Q&A and discussion is Jane Austen's novel Emma, first published in 1815. So over the next 90 minutes, we'll hear three talks and then we'll go to a chaired Q&A session. Emma is a fascinating novel and is enduringly popular. Most recently, it was adapted again for the screen earlier this year. Jane Austen herself said that she was going to take a heroine whom no one but myself will much like. Emma Woodhouse is introduced to us at the start of the text as handsome, clever, and rich. She had lived nearly 21 years in the world with very little to distress or vex her. So she's an unusual heroine, and that's partly why the text is so captivating. Our speakers today will take us into Emma's world of Highbury and the novel's place in the literary landscape of the early 19th century. I know we'll be hearing about Emma and constructed Englishness and the various texts of Emma, including the French translation and classical influences and hierarchies in the novel. As I mentioned just a moment earlier, don't forget to follow us on social media and use the hashtag Cardiff Book Talk to join the conversation. We've turned on captions for this event, but you can turn them off using the button at the bottom of your screen if you wish. Alongside me here today is my colleague on the Book Talk team, Colin Bond, who I'm going to hand over to now as he introduces our speakers for this evening. Get thinking of your questions and put them into the Q&A box at any point during the talks. I'll be back to chair the Q&A at the end, so see you again shortly. But here is Colin to introduce our first speaker this evening. Thanks, Colin.
Thanks, Anna. Our first speaker is Professor Anthony Manzol, who has written books and essays on Jane Austen, the Gothic, print culture, and contemporary fiction. He's also interested in book history and digital humanities, and is the director for the Centre for Editorial and Intertextual Research at Cardiff University. He's currently working on articles on Jane Austen and digital culture. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Colin. I hope, can you hear me all right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's all good.
Okay, so I'm just going to try and share my screen. Hopefully that worked before, so hopefully it'll work now. Right, okay, so I hope everyone can see that. Yeah, thank you, Colin, and thanks to Anna and the rest of the Book Talk team for the invitation to speak tonight. I'm really delighted to be joining the anniversary celebrations for the 10 years of Book Talk. I was actually lucky enough to present it on the very first Book Talk way back in 2010, which featured another romantic text, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So it's really lovely to be part of these celebrations. As well as celebrating the 10 years of Book Talk, this month also marks 245 years since Austen's birth, as well as Emma itself, despite being dated 1816 on its title page, was published just under 205 years ago on the 23rd of December 1815. So we've got a whole series of anniversaries that coalesce this evening. Emma represented something of a watershed in Austen's status as a writer and her literary career. Although she continued to publish anonymously, so you can see here from the title page, as the author of Pride and Prejudice, the novel was prefaced with a dedication to the Prince Regent, and there's a really fascinating backstory to that, which I don't have time to go into, but we can talk about it later on this evening if you're interested. Also, for Emma, Austen changed publishers, moving from the lesser-known Thomas Egerton, who was a family connection, to John Murray, whose business was one of the highest profile and most cosmopolitan in the Georgian book trade. Among his authors, Murray counted celebrities such as Lord Byron, Jermaine de Stael, and Walter Scott, as well as publishing the highly influential Tory periodical, The Quarterly Review. Shortly after the publication of Emma, Murray solicited a review of it from Walter Scott for The Quarterly. And this review is quite interesting because it observes that novels like Emma belong to a class of fictions which has arisen almost in our own times. There's something new. There's something that have emerged recently. And and the novel draws characters and incidents introduced more immediately from the current of ordinary life than was permitted by the formal rules of the novel. So he's talking about the development of the novel and how Emma represents transformation from the fantastical into the quotidian, and is representative then of a whole slew of novels that appeared around this period. He goes on to say that these novels neither alarm our credulity nor amuse our imagination of wild variety of incident, or by those pictures of romantic affection and sensibility of earlier forms of fiction. And in a famously evocative passage, Scott playfully states that at Highbury, Cupid walks decorously and with good discretion, bearing his torch under a lantern instead of flourishing it around to set the house on fire. So the kind of delicacy and nuance of Austen's writing is brought to the fore as well. But with this sense of focus on the everyday in mind, I want to suggest that Austen's decorous lantern shines a light on the socio-political climate of the period, which in turn informed the composition of Austen's novel in substantial ways. I think we're, in addition to the anniversaries that we've mentioned at the start of this evening, facing another important date in December, as December marks the last month before the UK leaves the European Union on January the 1st next year. And anyone who's been following the debates over the last 5 years will no doubt be aware that a large part of the conversation has circled around British national identity, and British national identity, particularly within its European context. And what I'd like to suggest is many of the key pillars of present day Britishness and that sense of identity were actually established during Austen's lifetime. So this is a kind of important moment for the present day, as well as looking back 200 something years ago. This sense of British national identity was seeded in the 1789 revolution and spanned 3 decades. It resulted in an unremitting war that had been fought with France, and a large number of battles were lost and won on both sides. By the Regency period, Napoleon had become an omnipresent bogeyman who dominated British national thinking, and I've got some caricatures up on the screen that capture that sense of his presence in the cultural consciousness. Before the turn of the century, Europhilia had been a key characteristic of Georgian Britain, and a not insignificant amount of new translations of fiction in English had actually come from European originals. So up until about the 1800s, there was a real kind of connection, a very sort of positively inflected connection within Britain towards the continent. And that begins to change in the context of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. So British eyes began to turn away from the continent, seeking instead an emphatic counter to the cause of the French revolutionaries for liberty, equality, fraternity, in the form of a Protestant individualism and community spirit that was particularly grounded in British values. A series of victories against Napoleonic tyranny throughout 1814 reassured Britons that anti-continentalism had paid off, translating the desperate earlier fears of invasion into the euphoric celebration of national steadfastness. British fiction of the Napoleonic period became increasingly preoccupied with matters of national identity, most obviously in the national tales of Anglo-Irish writers like Maria Edgeworth and Sidney Owenson, I've got up on the screen, and in the historical novels of Walter Scott, who's the third figure in that triptych. These novelists primarily focused on Ireland and Scotland respectively, and their complex relationship to the recently formed unions of Great Britain, 1707, and then the United Kingdom, 1801. Such inward inflections on nationhood were complemented by a more general turn in fiction towards the domesticity mentioned in Scott's review of Emma, a turn influenced by resurgent evangelicalism that sought to supply moral direction to what had been seen as a hitherto wayward genre of the novel. Reflecting culture that had been traumatically unsettled about its security and future, these fictions first scrutinized and then tangibly reformulated a previously nebulous sense of British nationhood. Miranda Burgess has commented that Austen's national romances reveal an often overlooked English thread among the early 19th century fictions of national character produced by such Scottish and Anglo-Irish writers such as Scott, Susan Ferrier, Edgeworth and Sidney Owenson. Her work stretched the borders of the genre Owenson named the national tale. It was not only England's colonies and dominions that produced fictions of resistance to foreign usurpation and cultural conquest, but also England itself. For the rest of tonight's talk, then, I want to focus on how the Englishness articulated in Emma forms another essential strand of this wider project of constructing Britishness. Around the time that she was writing Emma, Austen exchanged a series of letters with her niece Anna, who was attempting herself to write a novel and sought guidance from her aunt. So in September 1814, Austen advised Anna that 3 or 4 families in a country village is the very thing to work on. Discussing Anna's novel in a bit more detail, a month earlier she had admonished, let the Portmans, so these are characters in Anna's novel, let the Portmans go to Ireland, but as you know nothing of the manners there, you'd better not go with them. You'll be in danger of giving false representations. Stick to Bath and the Foresters. There you will be quite at home. This exchange sheds light then on Austen's own technique in creating Highbury, which was a quotidian world drawn from Austen's own immediate experience, one based on her empirical perceptions of provincial English life. Moreover, the novel is less a mirror of that provincial English life than a manifesto for correct English behaviour, tightly enclosed within the triangle whose vertices are Highbury, Hartfield and Randalls. The narrator specifically locates Highbury in Surrey in relation to 3 actual locations. It's 16 miles away from London, 9 from Richmond and 7 from Box Hill. Mrs. Elton calls Surrey the Garden of England, while Emma responds that we must not rest our claims on that distinction. Many counties, I believe, are called the Garden of England as well as Surrey. I think here the term Garden of England can be taken not only to signal, say, the prettiest landscape of the nation, but also as a distillation of what is quintessentially England. So all the kind of positive, verdant aspects of English culture. And these kind of terms index broader Georgian debates about land ownership and conservation, most famously represented by political philosophers like Edmund Burke and landscape architects like Capability Brown and Humphrey Repton. And the background I've got there is one of Capability Brown's landscaped gardens. More to the point, because Surrey is one of many such places that can call themselves the Garden of England, it becomes imbued with a metonymic status that means it can represent the nation as a whole. So the part becomes representative of the entirety. A contrast is drawn between here and there, between the provincial world depicted by Austen and those metropolitan parts of the country which are mainly seen as negative. Modern cities like London and Bath have adverse influences on characters like John Knightley, Mrs. Elton and Frank Churchill. Other locations, further afield but still specifically British, are also introduced but only feature off stage. Enscombe, the seat of the aristocratic Churchills, is a grander version of the Bertram's isolated Mansfield Park. And even when they come to Surrey, the Churchills are disdainfully aloof from Highbury, preferring to remain in Richmond. The fashionable resort of Weymouth features as the location of putative romance. Initially, Emma's suspected scene of an illicit love affair between Jane and Mr. Dixon, itself indirectly but tellingly linked to Ireland, and ultimately shown to be the origin of Frank and Jane's secret engagement. And of course, Emma famously says that she hasn't seen the sea, suggesting that kind of sense of containment. Highbury is a particularized portrait of English life, circumscribed and isolated from other parts of England and from the rest of the world. In addition to disconnecting Highbury topographically, Austen also restricts the social fabric of the novel to the fluid but limited world of the gentry. The stability and ordinariness of provincial life is defended by the narrative, for instance, in the anti-picturesqueness of the landscape. As Emma comments to Mrs. Elton, we are rather out of the distance of the very striking beauties which attract the sort of parties you speak of. And we are a very quiet set of people, I believe, more disposed to stay at home than engage in schemes of pleasure. In his study, Atlas of the European Novel, 1800 to 1900, Franco Moretti locates how Austen's England takes on a specifically parochial and indeed home counties inflection. He says a pattern does indeed emerge here of exclusion. No Celtic fringe, only England, a much smaller space than the United Kingdom as a whole. And not even all of England, Lancashire, the North, the Industrial Revolution, all missing. Instead, we have the much older England, celebrated by the estate poems of topographical poetry, hills, parks, country houses. In Emma, the spectre of colonialism or slavery isn't raised as it had been in her previous novel, Mansfield Park. Likewise, the French context that will feature so prominently in her next novel, Persuasion, has yet to arrive. While the encounter of Frank and Harriet with the gypsies suggests some movement from the outside into Highbury, this episode is again kept off stage and is incorporated into Emma's imaginistic fantasy before being dismissed. Indeed, the furthest we get beyond the English shores occurs in the gossipy invocation of Ireland in Jane Fairfax's backstory, which I mentioned earlier. In these ways, outsiders are not incorporated into the world of Highbury, functioning instead as little more than ciphers. The novel centres all that's positive in and around Highbury, while any potentially subversive currents are shown to be alien and are excluded from it. Indeed, the novel's praxis weaves the gentry figures more closely into the provincial community than ever before. As the local landowner, Knightley is almost up to the task himself, but he has neglected his individual identity in favour of purely social patricianship. On the other hand, Emma has spent the first 2 decades of her life as an imaginist rather than embedding herself socially, and significant disruptions occur when she transgresses social mores at various crucial points in the novel. In its asocial romanticism, Emma's imaginism risks disrupting the fragile bonds that bring human beings together, and it must be united with Knightley's English sociability if the garden or gardens of England are to be suitably fed. Supplementing Austen's general depiction of the Highbury are 2 key episodes which occur in adjacent chapters in the 3rd volume of the novel. Each informs the other, juxtaposing a vignette of self-sustaining English parochialism with a wretched scene of social exclusion and fragmentation mismanaged by metropolitan influences. The first of these is the strawberry picking trip to Donwell Abbey, hosted by Knightley. And making the invitation, he demonstrates appropriate concern for his guests, ensuring that meals will be eaten indoors, not to exclude Mr. Woodhouse and his valetudinarianism, and taking responsibility for the project himself, rather than inappropriately submitting to Mrs. Elton's importuned desire to take charge of the event. Once at Donwell, Emma focalised the experience in halcyon terms. We're told she felt all the honest pride and complacency which her alliance with a present and future proprietor could fairly warrant. The prospect is low and sheltered, but the rambling Donwell Abbey estate includes a stream, an abundance of timber in rows and avenues which neither fashion nor extravagance had rooted up, and integrating the social with the topographical, the Abbey Mill farm of the yeoman Robert Martin. In a key passage that concludes Emma's survey of the landscape, Austen establishes a dichotomy between the liberality of Donwell Abbey, metonymically representing the English nation state, and elsewhere, which we can read perhaps as Napoleonic Europe under the yoke of tyranny. So we're told, it was a sweet view, sweet to the eye and the mind, English verdure, English culture, English comfort, seen under a sun bright without being oppressive. Indeed, Austen's use of England and English throughout Emma is mostly polemical, with the majority of its 18 references emphasizing Englishness as a moral or psychological category rather than a geographical linguistic frame of reference. The other novel that uses English and England a lot is Sense and Sensibility, and there the usage is much more neutral and sort of denotative rather than ideologically laden. So we're told that oh, sorry, I thought I had the slide there. But anyway, we're told that John and George Knightley greet each other in the true English style, bearing under a calmness that seemed all but indifference, the real attachment which would have led either of them, if requisite, to do everything for the good of the other. Donwell Abbey's strawberries are, according to Mrs. Elton, the best fruit in England, everybody's favourite, always wholesome. Knightley and Donwell signal a model of Englishness that carries overtones of provincialism, honesty, and integrity. More particularly when Knightley tells Emma, I have blamed you and lectured you, and you have borne it as no other woman in England would have borne it. We're to understand this praise as superlative. So despite her initial misrecognitions, Emma's English virtues have triumphed over her un-English imaginism, redeeming her from moral failure. After the perfect Englishness or English perfection of the Donwell visit, Austen presents us with its opposite, the trip to Box Hill. Box Hill is not only a number of miles away from Highbury, but the excursion also arises from self-interest, an attempt to cure or relieve boredom through this kind of mindless entertainment. Moreover, the event is superintended by Mrs. Elton and Mr. Weston, with the latter's undiscriminating friendliness implicitly and negatively compared to Knightley's genteel benevolence. Once the party arrives, the scene is as different from that at Donwell as possible. We're told there was a languor, a want of spirits, a want of unison which could not be got over. They separated too much into parties. While Knightley had taken pains to ensure the comfort of everybody, on Box Hill there is a principle of separation between the other parties, too strong for any fine prospects or any cold collation or any cheerful Mr. Weston to remove. The exclusion practiced on Box Hill fosters a dangerous individualism, which asserts itself at the expense of social cohesion and comfort. Its principal victims are shown to be the marginalized figures who, more than any other, require the protection of the privileged, and we see that culminate painfully when Emma pokes cruel fun at Miss Bates during the game of riddles initiated by Frank. Once again, I'd suggest that we can read this scene through the discourse of national identity. If Knightley was the overseer of the Donwell outing, here Frank Churchill is its presiding genius. He's been absent from the visit to Donwell until the very end, and when he does arrive, he's in bad spirits and tellingly sick of England, a confession after the celebration of all things English that has preceded his appearance, which gives us an insight into his character. But there is an ironic modulation in Frank's name itself. After all, he's hardly frank in his dealings with Highbury, keeping his engagement to Jane secret and toying with her feelings publicly. But he can also be seen as Frankish, that is French in his attitude, and such concepts of nationhood are polarized into a dichotomy between Frank and George Knightley, whose own name carries a sense of true English valor and kingship. Before he even arrives at Highbury, in the debate between Knightley and Emma over Frank's character, he's already been associated with France at the cost of his Englishness. So Knightley says, Emma, your amiable young man can be amiable only in French, not in English. He may be very aimable, have very good manners, and be very agreeable, but he can have no English delicacy towards the feelings of other people, nothing really amiable about him. Fiona Stafford, in her edition of the Penguin, Emma, notes that the very fact that Frank says he wishes to be a true citizen of Highbury rather than a subject might ironically carry its own Francophile subtext. Frank is an indeterminate character whose patronymic is detached. Is he a Weston or is he a Churchill? And he oscillates between Highbury and Enscombe without being fixed in either. While certainly charming and pleasant, he has none of the social sympathy and active benevolence of a true English gentleman like George Knightley. Okay, to wrap up then, Emma continues the work begun with Mansfield Park, which examined the social and moral rhythms of life within the country estate. This isolated world is shown to be on the brink of collapse by the end of Mansfield Park, so Austen turns instead to the dynamic between the village and its gentry custodians. The novel seeks to reintegrate and reinvigorate the gentry within the broader village community, offering a mutually sustaining network that incorporates the gentry and middling ranks of Regency England, but is careful never to step beyond them. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Anthony. Our next speaker is Dr. Jillian Dao of the University of Southampton, and she specialises in the work of British women writers and translation in the 1750 to 1830 period. Her research interests include Jane Austen and contemporary literature and culture, and the rise of the novel in the long 18th century more generally. She has a long association with Chawton House Library from 2014 to 19 as executive director. Thank you, Jillian.
Thank you very much, Colin. Let me start then by sharing I hope everyone can see this okay, and you'll let me know if you can't. So I'd like to thank Anna very much for inviting me to give this talk. And following on from Anthony's discussion of this most English of English novels, this most national of national tales, I'm going to be arguing something quite different, that it can be read very fruitfully as an important text in terms of the cross-channel exchange in fiction. By this, I mean a market for fiction that's centred round the booksellers of London and Paris, and in which novelists themselves were influenced by fiction from both sides of the channel. I explored some of these ideas in an exhibition at Chawton House in 2016, and you can see a version of that exhibition online, published in the Jane Austen Society of North America's journal, Persuasions Online. So exploring early translations is also one of the learning activities in this free online course designed by me and colleagues at the University of Southampton, which is running at the moment. I think we've even got some participants. Hello, Future Learn Jane Austen. From the point of view of translations of Emma, the French translation appeared very early in 1816, anonymously translated for Paris-based publisher Artus Bertrand, who seems to have had a really keen eye on what was being published across the channel. Now, when in 1816, La Nouvelle Emma was published, so the new Emma, it was as more or less a straight translation of Jane Austen's original, but it had a lengthy anonymous preface designed for the French reader. Now, in this preface, the French reader would be told that Austen's work was not, in fact, a novel at all, but rather an ethnographic guide for the visitor to England. This is not, strictly speaking, a novel. It's a tableau of the manners of the time. One will recognise the customs and habits of the small towns of the provinces. There are no enchanted castles, no giants, everything is natural. Now, the publisher Artus Bertrand was known as a publisher of sentimental fiction. Indeed, one of his best-selling authors was Isabelle de Montolieu. She's the Franco-Swiss translator of Austen's Sense and Sensibility, which had appeared just the year before in 1815, again published by Artus Bertrand, exactly a year before the publication of La Nouvelle Emma. Now, here is the title page for La Nouvelle Emma, so this first French translation of 1816, and the conclusion to the preface, which is really quite lengthy. It's a sustained engagement with Austen's text. Now, the preface recognised that Jane Austen's path was to focus on the everyday, the ordinary, and characters we all recognise, whether in France or in England. And indeed, this French preface reminds me of nothing so much as Walter Scott's careful and sustained engagement with Emma in his famous quarterly review of the novel, which you just heard Anthony talking about. I'm interested too in this conclusion. So you can see here that what the French preface does is it ends with with some thoughts on the good English gentleman and what a gentilhomme might be, and a sort of joke round the king may make him a duke as he pleases, but I'll be damned if he can make a gentleman of him, and translates that. And then it goes on to conclude with a reference to the moral of Emma. What's the moral? And here the French preface ends by saying that one could say what another author said of their own work, which is that mothers can recommend that their daughters read it. Now, this question of what daughters and indeed mothers and women in general should read seems to me to be at the heart of Emma, and it's certainly important to a source text, as I shall demonstrate. So this is Artus Bertrand's published translation of Emma, and I've already said that I think he was looking across the channel at John Murray II's publications in deciding what translations he himself should publish. John Murray II, who of course you just heard from Anthony, Jane Austen moved to for the publication of this, her fourth novel. Now, John Murray had his eye across the channel too. So many readers of Austen know John Murray II primarily because of Austen's words in her letter to her sister Cassandra of him in October 1815. He's a rogue, of course, but a civil one. But what fewer people, I think, recognise perhaps is that the House of Murray didn't specialise in the publication of novels at all. When he took on the publication of Emma in late 1815, Murray had only published 5 other novels. And with Emma, he was publishing only his second woman writer. His first was a translation of Stéphanie Félicité de Genlis's Duchess of La Vallière, a historical novel from a prolific and popular French author we're going to come back to. And in fact, in 1815, when Austen published Emma with John Murray, the Franco-Swiss author, Madame de Staël, Germaine de Staël, was John Murray's most celebrated female author. She wrote this letter, you've got a little fragment of your screen there, during an extended stay in London in 1813. And at this time, John Murray was preparing a new French edition of Staël's 1810 work, De l'Allemagne, and an English translation of it, so Germany, this work was called. Staël took great care over the proofs and the translation of her work. This can be clearly seen in several notes accompanying corrections that can be read in the Murray archive up at the National Library of Scotland. So again, I'm suggesting that cross-channel exchanges are important for publishing houses in this period, and particularly important for the House of Murray, this most cosmopolitan of publishing houses. Now, Benjamin, so thinking about 1816 and the year in which Austen's Emma was published, well, December 1815, but, you know, with 1816 on the title page. Benjamin Constant's Adolphe is another example of what I would term a transnational novel in this period. So Adolphe was written in French by a Swiss Protestant writer, Germaine de Staël's lover, in fact, and it's set in provincial Germany and Poland. Now, Constant's connections with European literary elites saw the novel a success even before publication. Lady Caroline Lamb tried to persuade John Murray II to publish it, attempting to use her relationship with both Constant and Murray to mediate its success. For reasons unknown, although presumably to do with the lack of emphasis on the novel genre in general, John Murray declined to publish Adolphe. The novel was eventually published in French in London, and then also in translation in London, both by Henry Colburn on Conduit Street. And only then was it published in French in Paris. Henry Colburn had something of a line in translations from the French in the period. He also published Jean Lisse's Jane of France, another historical novel in this year. I keep returning to Jean Lisse quite deliberately, because one of her novels, you'll remember, gets something of a starring role at the end of Emma. You'll remember that towards the end of the novel, Mrs. Weston celebrates the birth of a daughter, and Emma's response is as follows. She has had the advantage, you know, of practicing on me, she continued, like la Baronne d'Allemagne on La Comtesse d'Austerlitz in Madame de Genlisse's Adelaide and Theodore, and we shall now see her own little Adelaide educated on a more perfect plan. So Emma here is comparing herself to the Comtesse d'Austerlitz, a character in Jean Lisse's novel. The comparison is supposed to be modest. Mrs. Weston has practiced educating a child already, so she will have a more perfect plan to educate her own daughter with. But the comparison is not quite as modest as it first appears. The novel Adelaide and Theodore shows Madame d'Austerlitz as one of the most brilliant women, and certainly the best educated of her generation. Now, this is Austen's narrator's joke at the expense of her heroine, perhaps. We all remember Knightley's mocking of Emma's plan for her reading in conversation with Mrs. Weston at the beginning of the novel. Knightley talks about Emma's reading lists, very well chosen and very neatly arranged. And you'll remember that as far as the list she drew up when she was only 14 is concerned, I remember thinking it did her so much credit that I preserved it some time. And I dare say she may have made out a very good list now. Now, anyone who has read Jean Lisse's Adelaide and Theodore will know that it concludes with an extensive reading list of exactly what Adelaide read at exactly what age. And what the 14-year-old Adelaide read is quite extraordinary. I'm giving you the relevant extract here, and you can see she's reading, she's translating, she's taking extracts of a variety of French, English and Italian texts. You can see here Boissy, Marivaux, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu and Goldoni's comedies, to mention just a few of the items on her reading list. If Emma Woodhouse's list, age 14, was anything like this one, then it's no wonder Knightley thought, presumably very much tongue-in-cheek, that it did her much credit. Now, there are more links as far as plot is concerned between Austen's Emma and Jean Lisse's Adelaide and Theodore. In fact, if one takes the crime writer P.D. James's comments that Emma is the first detective novel seriously, we can work back from this concluding comparison between Emma, the heroine, and the Comtesse d'Austerlitz to a crucial moment in the first volume of Emma, the moment when Emma convinces herself that Mr. Elton is in love with Harriet Smith because of the attention he pays to the portrait of her, little realizing that Mr. Elton's attentions are to her as painter, not to Harriet as the subject of the painting. Was this confusion suggested by a plot detail in Adelaide and Theodore? Perhaps. There's certainly a moment when the character Charles de Valmont is discovered to be in love with the Comtesse d'Austerlitz because he blushes when seeing a painting by, not of her. Here's the relevant passage. We waited on Madame d'Allemagne, and there it was, Charles betrayed himself entirely. She showed us a picture of Madame de Valcy, painted by Madame d'Austerlitz. His confusion at the sight of this picture was so visible that it certainly could not escape the penetrating eyes of Madame d'Allemagne. I felt the necessity of an immediate explanation. And it goes on to reveal that Charles de Valmont is in love with Madame d'Austerlitz. That's what causes his confusion and embarrassment. Now, Charles de Valmont is not Mr. Elton. I'm not arguing that he is, but I do think that Emma herself, who drew Harriet and convinced herself that Mr. Elton was in love with her protege, prompts comparisons with Genlis's Madame d'Austerlitz in volume 1 of Austen's Emma, long before we get the direct reference to the novel in volume 3. I've argued before in talks and indeed in print that Genlis, and indeed French fiction more broadly, is a significant author for Jane Austen and indeed the whole Austen family. We know, for example, that in January 1815, just as Jane Austen was writing Emma, Cassandra Austen gifted this little volume of Genlis's plays to her niece and goddaughter, Caroline Austen. You can see this, the very addition and description here. It's now in the collection at Chawton House. And in this text, we can clearly see markings, underlinings, and wonderfully on the right of this image at the top here, a sketch of a dog. These then were plays that were read, perhaps even performed in the extended Austen family. And I want to leave you with a suggestion that another play by Genlis may very well have been a source text, or at the very least suggestive for Austen while she was composing Emma. That play was Pygmalion and Galatée, a reworking of the Pygmalion myth via Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Pygmalion of 1762. Now, Genlis published her Pygmalion et Galatée in a collection of new moral and historical tales in 1802 to 1803. I have no direct evidence that Austen read it, but bearing in mind her knowledge of and reference to Genlis's work, I think it's very likely that she did. And who was reading Genlis's adaptation of the Pygmalion myth in July 1816? Well, that would be Jane Austen's contemporary, Mary Shelley, working up the publication of Frankenstein, another novel of the 18 teens with pan-European roots, and interestingly turned down by John Murray II for publication. Big mistake, as another Pygmalion figure, Julia Roberts' Pretty Woman, might have said. Huge. So I hope then I've suggested in this short talk that looking at Emma from outside 3 or 4 families in a country village, indeed from outside its country of composition, can be fruitful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jillian. It's so interesting to hear two such very different takes on the context of the book there. Our third and final speaker tonight is Dr. Mariam Wassif. She received her PhD from Cornell University in 2018 with a specialization in British and French literature of the long 18th century. She is currently a postdoc at the University of Paris 1, Pantheon-Sorbonne, studying classical influence and notions of beauty, artifice and style in literature and material culture around 1800. Her book manuscript in progress is entitled Poisoned Vestments, Rhetoric and Material Culture in England and France, 1660 to 1820. And you can follow Mariam on Twitter at Dr. Mariam Wassif. Mariam, thank you.
Thank you so much, Colin. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So thank you so much, Anna, and all of the organizing team for organizing this. I really enjoyed Jillian and Anthony's talk, and it leads very well into mine. My talk is entitled Emma, Empire, and the Myth of Pygmalion. And I'm going to continue our theme of discussing the novel in a national and an international context. And I want to take us a bit further afield, out of Highbury and Surrey, and even beyond France, going back in time to the ancients, as well as outwards in space towards empire. The connection between Austen classical myth and empire may not seem evident at first, but with the expansion of empire, Britons drew comparisons between themselves and ancient Rome. Specifically, much as Romans believed the narrative of translatio imperii, the transfer of empire from earlier powers to Rome, Britons saw themselves as the next link in the chain. They found a parallel in the transition from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire, which according to some caused a moral decline correlating with the increase in wealth and luxury. Educated people could make such comparisons because formal education still prioritized classical learning. Women weren't typically educated this way, but Austen's clergyman father appears to have included her in the lessons he gave his sons. In a letter to her sister, Cassandra Austen, Austen shows her knowledge of Greek and Latin writers. She regrets her brother Edward's lack of response to some of her verses, writing, "They seem to me purely classical, just like Homer and Virgil, Ovid and Propriae Maribus." That last phrase is a pun on the name of the poet Propertius, using a slight misquotation from a lesson in the Eton Latin grammar. The classic scholar Mary de Forest argues that by evoking Homer, Virgil, Ovid, and Propertius, Austen aligns herself with the anti-heroic tradition of poets who wrote not of the epic deeds of great men, but of supposedly lower, female-centered themes such as love. Ovid's collection, Metamorphoses, was indeed looked down upon as a set of mere love stories. Pygmalion is the tale of a bachelor who lives alone because of his disgust with female sexuality. The tale preceding Pygmalion's tells of the wrath of Venus as she transforms the daughters of Propoetus into the first prostitutes before finally turning them to stone. The story of Pygmalion picks up here. One man, Pygmalion, who had seen these women leading their shameful lives, shocked at the vices nature had given the female disposition only too often, chose to live alone, to have no woman in his bed. To pass the time, Pygmalion crafts a statue more beautiful than any living girl, a virginal figure who is white as snow, conflating whiteness, beauty, and purity. Enamored of his creation, Pygmalion begins to offer gifts to the statue and to dress its limbs. He strokes it and marvels upon it until it seems to come alive to his touch. After praying 3 times at the altar of Venus, Pygmalion gets the wish that he hardly dares utter. The statue blushes, glows, and softens, and the eyes of Galatea open to look upon the lover. In the preceding story, Ovid tells of women turned to stone by their shamelessness, but the story of Pygmalion sees an ivory statue turn to flesh through love, and in turn warm the flesh of the artist himself. Pygmalion and Galatea wed and have a daughter, and the rom-com marriage plot is complete. But this multi-layered tale speaks of sexual or romantic initiation, of the porous boundaries between art and life, and of a complex gendered dynamic of power. Pygmalion despises women, so he creates one to his taste, but he has to pray to Venus to bring her to life. These subjects, art, romance, and power, are also central to Emma. In the power part of the Triad, Austen demonstrates that a domestic tale of love can still be outward-looking and expansive. It's easiest to map the dynamic between Galatea and Pygmalion onto the relationship between Emma and Mr. Knightley, a younger woman and an older man who serves as a moral instructor. But while Mr. Knightley sometimes chastises Emma, theirs is a largely equal relationship, one of social and intellectual equals. This is not the case for the relationship between Emma and her new friend, Harriet Smith. It's possible to miss an unsettling dynamic of power between these women because the novel is so fun and funny. Nothing bad really happens, and Emma is well-intentioned and lovable. But Emma is described as having too much power from the beginning. The opening line presents her as handsome, clever, and rich, a woman with very little to distress and vex her. Austen then reveals that very little which distresses and vexes Emma. The real evils, indeed, of Emma's situation were the power of having too much her own way and a disposition to think a little too well of herself. In 21st century language, Emma is privileged and unaware of the harm that can ensue from unchecked power. While in much of the novel we share Emma's consciousness, knowing what she knows and discovering with her, in those opening lines, an ironic distance between the narrator and Emma shows us something about the character that she herself cannot see, priming us to turn a skeptical eye to Emma. Emma applies her powers to the apparently benign task of matchmaking. When she meets Harriet Smith, she finds the ideal fixer-upper, her own ivory white statue to shape as she wills. Harriet is perfectly qualified for the role. She is, quote, the natural daughter of somebody. Natural daughter being a period euphemism for illegitimate. Harriet knows nothing of her parents and background. She's a blank slate on whom Emma can project romantic fantasies. Emma is also drawn to Harriet because she is pretty and she is good-tempered, but that is all, as Mr. Knightley says. Unlike the other, much-lauded orphan of the novel, Jane Fairfax, Harriet is pretty in a non-threatening way. She is Emma's inferior in intellect and social clout, and she is as malleable as Pygmalion's softening ivory statue, yielding to Emma's persuasions. Emma decides that she would improve her. She would notice her. She would detach her from bad acquaintance and introduce her into good society. She would form her opinions and her manners. It would be interesting and certainly a very kind undertaking, highly becoming her own situation in life, her leisure and powers. Pygmalion-like, Emma has a semi-erotic fascination with Harriet, although that erotic energy must be redirected to heterosexual marriage. In her first conversation with Harriet, Emma loses track of time. She was so busy in admiring those soft blue eyes, in talking and listening and forming all those schemes in the in-betweens that the evening flew away. Mr. Knightley goes so far as to say, Emma, your infatuation about that girl blinds you. And when he accuses Emma of wanting to marry Harriet off to Mr. Elton, Emma responds, I only want to keep Harriet to myself. Pygmalion hugging her creation. This possessiveness manifests in Emma's efforts to better her friend. The scene where Emma draws a portrait of Harriet crystallizes this project. Like Pygmalion, Emma wishes not just to imitate life, but to improve it. She makes Harriet taller, as Mr. Knightley criticizes, and gives her the eyebrows and eyelashes which Mrs. Weston says are the only beauty Harriet lacked. And this is the scene from the recent Autumn de Wilde adaptation in which you can see Harriet dressed in a classical style, which is very appropriate. So these changes, making her taller, giving her eyebrows and eyelashes, are superficial changes to an amateur portrait that serves as a pretext for bringing Harriet and Mr. Elton together. But the portrait scene is emblematic of Emma's artful attempts to reshape Harriet. The allusion to visual arts recalls the sculptor Pygmalion. But like Ovid, Austen uses visual art as a stand-in for verbal arts. Emma is not a skilled portraitist, but she is an effective rhetorician, using her powers of verbal persuasion to shape Harriet's mind and behavior, if not her body. In doing so, Emma takes on a conventionally masculine role, which becomes clear in the argument between Emma and Mr. Knightley over Harriet's refusal to marry Robert Barton. What's brilliant about this argument is how Emma unknowingly tells on herself. She accuses Mr. Knightley of underestimating the value of Harriet's humility and sweetness. I am very much mistaken, she says, if your sex in general would not think such beauty and such temper the highest claims a woman could possess. Mr. Knightley retorts, men of sense, whatever you may choose to say, do not want silly wives. But that is what Emma herself wants, a silly companion who flatters her sense of superiority. The proto-feminist tone of Emma's remark is undercut by the fact that Emma reproduces the behavior she is criticizing. She seeks the company of those who don't challenge her. We see this desire at work in the interactions between Emma and Frank Churchill, a potential suitor. If there is a Pygmalion statue dynamic between Emma and Harriet, Emma and Frank have something like the relationship between Echo and Narcissus, another story in Ovid's Metamorphoses. It tells of the beautiful youth Narcissus and the nymph Echo who falls in love with him, but has no power of speech, except the ability to echo the last words that she has heard. One example of this echoing is the exchange between Emma and Frank as they attempt to plan a dance at the Crown. Frank says, "I think there will be very tolerable room for 10 couple." Emma replies, No, you are quite unreasonable. It would be dreadful to be standing so close. Nothing can be farther from pleasure than to be dancing in a crowd, and a crowd in a little room." Frank self-corrects. "There is no denying it. I agree with you completely. A crowd in a little room. Miss Woodhouse, you have the art of giving pictures in a few words. Exquisite, quite exquisite." Frank echoes Emma's last words back to her, a crowd in a little room, adding praise. And even Emma notices that he is a little too gallant. But she forgives this amiable fault because she doesn't know at the time that he is manipulating her. Apart from such subtle allusions, the style of Emma, the novel, is Ovidian. Ovid's writing was criticized as overly rhetorical, relying too much on verbal extravagance and display. In Emma, Austen gives us a novel full of wit and wordplay, of charades and riddles. The surprises of the plot depend on Austen playing a verbal game with us, which is a delight to unravel with each rereading. Ovid's supposedly superficial style was seen as a hallmark of imperial writing, where in the Roman Republic, oratory such as that of Cicero could sway the fate of civilization. Critics saw imperial writing as empty entertainment removed from the scene of political action. The dazzling artistry of this work stood for the extravagance of empire itself, the indulgence in materialism and the showy displays of power on which empire depended. In ancient Rome, as much as in modern Britain. But Ovid and Austen prove that an entertaining work is not necessarily apolitical. Both writers are complicit in the imperial context, but they also reflect on that context. In Ovid's work, imperial expansion manifests in love stories that are also stories of violence and enslavement, and of the lover mastering the beloved, reflecting how empire depended on the conquest of bodies as much as land. Just as Ovid wrote at a transitional moment in Roman history, he was born the year after the assassination of Julius Caesar, Austen's career oversaw a time of growing wealth that depended on exploiting foreign lands and peoples. Austen wrote Emma in 1814 and 15, after the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, but before the abolition of slavery itself in the British colonies in the 1830s. Like Ovid, Austen interweaves the subjects of love and enslavement. Take the silly charade that Mr. Elton submits to Emma's collection. "My first displays the wealth and pomp of kings, lords of the earth, their luxury and ease." This refers to court, as Emma deduces. "Another view of man my second brings, behold him there, the monarch of the seas." That refers to ship. But united in the word courtship, what reverse we have? Man's boasted power and freedom, all are flown. Lord of the earth and sea, he bends a slave, and woman, lovely woman, reigns alone. The charade evokes the hackneyed trope of the conquering hero who is finally conquered by feminine charm and gives up his freedom, which depends on the enslavement of others, to bend a slave to lovely woman. Both the style of the charade and its author undermine the simplistic idea of a simple reversal of power between men and women in the context of love. The charade also reveals how lightly Britons of the time could evoke the topic of slavery and make comparisons in spite of the raging abolition debates, and this happened several times in the novel. Austen may not have a clear abolitionist program in Emma, but her exploration of the dynamics of power is much more sophisticated than Mr. Elton's. In Emma's efforts to improve Harriet, Austen underlines the logic of imperial conquest, which seeks to form and cultivate not just land, but peoples, who are seen as virgin territory that can be molded into an idealized image of oneself, while being kept in a state of perpetual inferiority. Emma would never want Harriet to be her equal, let alone her superior. In Emma's efforts to polish the raw material of Harriet, Austen foregrounds how empires grow not just through military might, but through enculturation, the diffusion of cultures. What some might dismiss as mere verbal play and entertainment, Austen reveals as the serious work of bending minds. She alerts us to the empire of words and images in which we live and the power they have over us. Finally, Emma, the novel, foregrounds how patriarchal power works between two people of the same gender but different social status, not forgetting that hierarchies of class depend on ideas of genetic superiority that also organize racial hierarchies. In giving Emma, the character, the dominant position of Pygmalion or Narcissus, Austen doesn't denounce women who assume typically masculine roles. Instead, she demonstrates how power depends on context. Undoing it is not just a question of transferring power from one group to another, but of understanding how power operates and how it structures relationships in shifting and dynamic ways. Emma might be disadvantaged as a woman in some contexts, but she has power in others. In our current moment of re-examining white middle-class femininity, it seems to me that Austen's Emma has something provocative to say on the subject. I want to close by emphasizing that I don't read Emma as a sinister figure. She has the capacity to reflect on her mistakes. I find it endearing that she can realize that she has done wrong, repent, resolve never to do it again, and then fall into the same pattern. To my mind, Austen's remarkable ability to balance comedy and lightness with scorching social criticism is what keeps us coming back to her and to Emma. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mariam. I am applauding, and I'm sure plenty of other people are also applauding, as we did for Jillian and Anthony too. Thank you so much for a really fascinating talk. I mean, I think these talks really convinced us, if we do need convincing, that 3 or 4 families in a country village is so relevant to the world beyond that small isolated community on a national and an international level. And that's partly why the novel is so enduring and popular. It really captured the uniqueness of Emma, I think, which is my favorite Austen novel. I always have to say that. And also, I suppose, significant as the final novel published by Austen in her lifetime anyway. So we're going to do a Q&A now. So I've got a few questions in the Q&A box. If you want to add your question, please do put it in there. Useful to know if you're asking one speaker or all speakers. But I think, Colin, do you want to kick us off? You have a question to start with.
Yeah. I'm reading Emma for the first time at the moment, and one of my favourite Emma facts that I encountered was that Samuel Beckett was a big fan, which seems to me very surprising. And if you read bits of Emma in a very slow, forlorn-sounding Samuel Beckett-esque voice, there are these. It is hilarious, and you can kind of see what he gets from it. Sort of long, convoluted sentences that maybe don't quite say what they purport to be saying, and it's so interesting to sort of think about that influence. The question that I have, and thinking about how all of you have talked about how it's about empire, and it's about Englishness, and it's about this myth of Pygmalion, and about this idea that has she made something that everyone comes to and sees what they want, really, like, and why really has it has it stood the test of time? How come it's still a literary sensation in 2020? Who would like to start us off with that? Anthony?
Okay, I'm happy to give it a shot. I think there are a number of kind of key underlying questions there in your one quite focused one. I think, why has Emma stood the test of time? It's interesting, isn't it, that Emma and Pride and Prejudice are the two big ones, and I think probably Pride and Prejudice has the edge in terms of popularity. They're quite similar in some ways in their presentation of flawed heroines, although the way they were written is quite different. So Pride and Prejudice was written over successive decades in a number of sort of waves of writing, whereas Emma's written was part of a new wave of novels that Austen writes, and she writes it very, very economically. She writes it very quickly. And so a lot of Austen scholars have pointed to Emma as being the most cohesive of Austen's works as an aesthetic project. So as a piece of art, it's successful, going back to what Mariam was saying about kind of Pygmalion and crafting, that sense of its artistry. So I think the popularity of the novel lies in giving us a heroine that Anna mentioned, not many people would like, and yet making us root for her through it, making us want her to succeed, identifying, I think, with her failings. So I think that there's the kind of the technical achievement of Austen, who's not just a great reader of people, but she's a great reader of text. I mean, Jillian made that clear as well, the kind of interchange that operates between Austen's role as a writer and Austen's experience as a reader. So she's able to convey that, I think, in her writing generally. And it becomes very effective in Emma, because Emma, as a novel, isn't a kind of heavily literary text in the same way that Sense and Sensibility or Northanger Abbey are. But it makes us speculate on the role of the author. Again, going back to Mariam's point, and this idea of imaginism, I think, crafting and creating, I think is an important one. And what brings that kind of sort of valent aspect to Austen is a kind of effective use of free and direct discourse. I mean, she really is able to use that craft and those layers of other kind of textual histories from her reading, from her decades of writing in Emma, and they come together very, very effectively. And the ironic voice then pitches us backwards and forwards. So even as we root for Emma, we cringe at her mistakes. But that doesn't stop us kind of from being on her side, and even sometimes sort of taking offense to what Knightley says. Even if Knightley is right, we don't want him to be right. So I think that there's that kind of buy-in as well. The technical side coalesces with the psychological and social sides as well, so that we get a great sense of unity in the aesthetics. And I think that perhaps might explain why Emma, sort of vies with Pride and Prejudice as the kind of the most successful of Austen's novels, and also, among the most loved works of literature that have been published in the kind of the Anglophone sphere.
Mariam, you're nodding. Would you like to add something to that?
I was going. Oh.
I'm sorry, Jillian, do you want to go ahead?
No, please go ahead.
Yeah, I was just agreeing with everything Anthony said. Thank you so much, Anthony. That was a very complete answer. I'm thinking about your question, Colin, of Emma as a kind of Rorschach test in which we can read into it whatever we're looking for. And I think I'm thinking about Austen's use of language and her subtlety and the way that she lets the language do the work for her. For me, you never feel the sort of heavy hand of the author manipulating things. It feels, it all comes together in its own way. I'm not sure if I'm putting that very clearly, but I think that's part of Austen's artistry, and what some might consider the plainness of her style is actually what makes it a strength. So that's all I would add.
I was just going to add, Colin, to your point as well about we each bring what we want to this text. Just in relation to the first French translation and those first French readers who were not as bothered by the English nationalism in the text as we would expect them to be. And there's a question in the Q&A about what happens to the reference to Frank Churchill being too French in that first French translation. And it does indeed get pushed further south down to Italy. So Frank Churchill becomes aimable only in Italian, not in French. So yeah, it's a malleable text for those first readers who are not oppressed by the weight of canon. They don't know who Jane Austen is, and they don't care. They're going to mould Emma to be the book they want it to be.
Thank you. Looking at our questions in the Q&A, we have quite a lot. You'll just note that we probably won't be able to get to all of them today, but do keep putting them in there if you have questions, because we like to share them with everybody post the event. So we will be able to share the questions that have been asked. A couple of points have come up about free indirect discourse, and I think that might be something that would be useful for us to have a talk about if we're thinking about Emma and form. So Emily has asked about the literary qualities of the novel and how might a consideration of the novel's extraordinary use of free indirect discourse inflect your analyses. Anthony did mention it briefly, but and Susanna's actually asked if we could all just expand on what free indirect discourse is and the significance of it in Austen. I don't know if anyone wants to start. Anthony, you did mention it first. Would you like to kick off again? Thank you.
You had me just about to click unmute. Yeah, so free indirect discourse is a technique essentially that basically moves between the perspective of the narrator and the perspective of, say, the protagonist or key characters within the novel. It's not just the protagonist. So, for instance, you might have a scene that's being described, and it's from the narrator's point of view, looking outside, and it's conveying fact. But then, as you read through that passage of text, it begins to drift into the perspective, or through the perspective of the characters in the scene. So the kind of the most famous, or for me, most famous Austen scene that does that is actually in Sense and Sensibility, where you have John and Fanny Dashwood talking about the inheritance that is sort of legally his, but has kind of morally been promised to his stepsisters. And the scene starts off with them talking about how much, they should fairly give to the sisters. But then Fanny kind of sort of pleads how cruel it would be to their child, bearing in mind they're very rich independently, how cruel it would be to their child to deny him of his due inheritance. And what we have in that passage then is a kind of erosion of objective fact in favor of subjective sort of feeling. And yet it's presented uniformly in the passage of text, so it's not broken up. It just becomes part of a kind of single unit. And Austen's not the first novelist to do this. There's a lot of sort of assumptions that Austen was the first novelist to do this successfully. I think Frances Burney, who very much influenced Austen, was a writer who used free indirect discourse a lot as well. So, and there were other writers who preceded Austen and Burney who used it, but Austen is seen as using it very, very effectively. And what it does is it opens up a kind of ironic gap then. And this is the important point, is that you get a kind of sense of, despite it being narrated from a point of view that moves backwards and forwards, it's the actual movement that then begins to generate an ironic tension where it exposes, and very successfully in Austen, it exposes the kind of misrecognitions of the characters, or the way they either misdirect themselves or they misdirect each other. So in that scene that I quoted, when Austen describes Emma looking at Donwell Abbey, and she's looking at the estate, and she's sort of surveying it. There's a kind of, it begins quite neutrally. She's looking at the estate. It's the prospect is low and sheltered. She's taking in the different topographical features. But we're also told that she looks upon it with complacency. And I think that if you think about the kind of the 18th century, early 19th century meanings of the word complacency, it doesn't mean someone who's smug. It actually means someone who is looking at and taking pride and an appropriate kind of satisfaction in what she's seeing. And the complacency that Austen describes Emma's feeling there is the connection that she shares through the marriage of her sister to John Knightley, to, at that point, George Knightley's heir, who would be John and Isabella's son. So there's that kind of sense in which what we have is a movement from Emma looking and seeing the scene to actually in her internal connections and sense of linkage. Now that's not ironic. It's not kind of in that scene poking fun at Emma, although it often is used that way. But it's another example of how there's a slippage, I think, between the external point of view and the character's perceptions, and that's what, going back to Colin's point, gives us the richness of Austen's work. You know, it kind of allows us to move in those interstices and negotiate around, and Austen is one of these writers, although we see it later on and we see it develop, say, modernist writing into more directly into things like stream of consciousness writing, but also you can think of a writer like Virginia Woolf who uses it very, very effectively, and so it becomes a kind of key tool in the box of writers through the 19th and into the 20th centuries to kind of convey those gaps between the kind of psychology of their characters and the external world that's trying, you know, sort of, that is being realistically rendered. So sorry, but I rambled a bit there. I kind of went into my own free and direct discourse, but I hope that kind of addresses some of the questions.
Yeah, no, thank you. That was really useful. I don't know if Jillian and Mariam want to add anything about that.
Sure, I'll add something. Yeah, just to summarize some of what Anthony said, Susanna, to your question, free and direct discourses, I described it in the beginning of my talk as a sort of shared consciousness that we have with Emma at times. And I talked about how those first lines give us a slightly more objective view of Emma. And there's an ironic distance so that we see something about her that she doesn't see herself. But that's not how most of the novel works. Often the narrative sort of hovers between Emma's consciousness and the more objective outside world that Anthony mentioned. And that goes back to the sort of verbal game that I was talking about, that Austen plays with us. And that's why the novel rewards rereading so much. It's because you have to go back and tease out, well, what's Emma's biased view, and what are we getting as a sort of authorial point of view from the narrator. And calling sort of free and direct discourse used in this way as a verbal game is not to diminish it at all. So as I'm saying, Austen is actually showing us how these sort of persuasive techniques operate in these very powerful ways. So that goes to sort of Emily's question about how the literary aspect and the social, national, international aspect come together.
Thanks. Jillian, do you have anything to add?
No, I mean, just to say that one of the interesting things about free and direct discourse is, of course, the French are starting to do it during this period, but they don't translate it very well. So one of those stylistic brilliancies of Emma does certainly lose something in the translation in this period. It's not till you get to Flaubert that you see the full flourishing across the channel.
Oh, thanks, Jillian. A couple of specific questions for certain speakers. I wonder, while we're talking about the French translations, Jillian, do you mind elaborating? Francis has just asked if these are authorized or pirated translations.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I mean there's a long story about how one might go about authorizing a translation in that period. It doesn't happen. There's no such thing really as an authorized translation until you get much later in the 19th century, and it's a publisher-author agreement. So, for example, there's absolutely no evidence that Jane Austen knew that her work was translated in her lifetime, and I strongly suspect she didn't. And Genlis was absolutely livid that so much of her work was being translated in England and selling so much, and she wasn't making a penny from it. What John Murray was very anxious about as a publisher in the period was not translations of work he published, but English editions being published in Paris. So the publishing house Galliani are bringing out complete works of Byron practically before John Murray himself has got to it. And travellers to the continent are buying editions of Wordsworth, editions of Byron for a fraction of the price in Paris booksellers. So translations are the least of the British publishing house's worries. What they're worried about is theft of the original English edition.
Wow, really interesting. That's a lot more complicated than I expected. So that's really, really fascinating to hear. Next question is directly for Mariam from Kerry. And this is really interesting. So Kerry says, Mariam, your wonderful analysis of the riddle, and I actually wanted to ask you more about the riddle, Mariam. Actually, I really enjoyed that part of your talk. Of the riddle made me think of Gayatri Spivak's soul making as a term for white women intimacies with their others. Was that in your mind, or was it other imperial modes of intimacy?
Let me unmute myself before I start talking. Carrie, thank you for the question. I wasn't thinking of Gayatri Spivak's idea of soul making at that point, but I certainly will be going back and looking at it now, because that's a perfect articulation of what I was trying to say. I think my larger point was that Austen shows us how these kinds of imperial intimacy operate at the level of home as well as abroad, and then are translated in sometimes more violent ways throughout empire. And I think that's one of the strengths of the novel, is that it shows us how these local dynamics can have these broader implications.
Thank you. I think the next question I'd like to put is to Anthony. How do you read the tension between the idea of the novel as a social order producing national tale and the rather poor reading habits of the novel's characters?
I think that's a really great question, and one probably I can only give a very, very crass answer to in the next minute or so. But I think it's part of a bigger project, isn't it, during this period that is about the regulation of social structures through permissible reading and, I guess, illicit reading, or certainly disruptive reading. So that being a poor reader in this period is a kind of moral debate. It's part of a moral debate, and a lot of the discussions during the period, reviews of novels, discussions about the novel, keep on pointing to it as a form of abandonment, kind of a literary distraction. Well, not even literary, a sub-literary distraction that demoralizes its readers. So there are a lot of images of both visual and textual, of particularly young women readers who are distracted by Gothic novels or sentimental romances that indoctrinate them into inappropriate modes of behavior. And this is a kind of key debate that goes on through the sort of closing decades of the 18th century and well into the 1800s. And it's interesting because this is precisely the time when new novels being published en masse. They're kind of growing. So what you have is a bigger appetite for reading, but attempts to more strictly control it than ever before in terms of the kind of discourse of regulation of proper reading and improper reading. And so Austen participates in that throughout, both her kind of literary works, but also you see that in her correspondence as well, where she talks a lot about reading and how reading becomes an index to the world. So and even in novels, you get this in a lot of novels, where novels themselves talk about not the novel and can often talk about it quite negatively, which is, you think is counterintuitive, but I think they're trying to stake the ground, the territory of their own sort of authority. And I think particularly if you think of Emma in this context of the national tale, the national tales of Sidney Owenson and Madame de Stael are very heavily laden with intertextuality. They particularly focus, I think, in terms of informing the readers about the authors being well read, but the characters themselves are producers of literature. They're producers of texts. So there's a difference there. They're not consumers of them as much as they are producers of them. And I think we get that in Emma in a certain way. I would say it's less, the debates are more nuanced in Emma than, say, in some of the other texts like Northanger Abbey and Sense and Sensibility, where they're really right at the surface. And those debates about kind of moral structure and moral order through the pages of reading are more sublimated. And I think it comes back to that issue of Imaginism and how Harriet sort of buys into Emma's, bad authorship of Highbury as a kind of romance of matchmaking. You see Emma sort of having this kind of infectious sort of influence over some of the figures around her. And that's, of course, what makes Frank so troublesome, because he kind of knows the rules of the game. He knows how to disrupt them, and he's got his own secret romance. I mean, the thing is, Emma's busy kind of matchmaking, creating all these fantasies. She misses the real romance under her very nose, which is that kind of love affair between Jane and Frank. And in a way, if you'd wanted a novel that was going to be a kind of romance, the story would be Jane Fairfax's story, not Emma's or Harriet's. And in fact, people have written sequels or alternate versions to Emma, which from the perspective or tell the story of Jane. And just to quickly wrap up, because I know I've gone on a bit too much, is that Scott's review, I mean, it's really interesting to read Scott's review in its entirety of Emma, because it's all about reading, and it kind of talks about the reader as a very feminized figure, and is quite dismissive in some ways. As much as it complements Austen and this new wave of fiction that Emma represents, it is quite dismissive about the kind of the impact of the new novel compared to the older romance. And I think at the back of his mind is the kind of what Walter Scott is doing with the novel. He's thinking, well, I've just published, 2 novels, and he's kind of writing in a very, very different register about incident and drama and adventure and big things, capital B, capital T, and I think there's that kind of distinction there in terms of not just what you read, but how you use that to read the world around you.
Oh, thanks, Anthony. I actually think I have a question, so I really want to ask it. And I think it kind of links to what you concluded with there about the idea of who is doing the reading. And I think it also links to what Mariam was talking about with regards to Emma's rhetoric in the novel, and also just about Emma abroad in Europe and in relation to Europe, as Jillian and Anthony have touched on tonight. So I wanted to ask about audience and readership. I wanted to know, to what extent do you think Austen is writing a character like Emma, who is an unusual heroine, which is something I'm particularly interested in. It's something I've been talking to my students, I think some of them are here tonight, about a lot this week. To what extent do you think Austen is writing a character like Emma as a heroine for a particular kind of Regency audience? Do the qualities of Emma show that she was deeply concerned with her audience and their recognition of the world that Emma exists in? I hope it's not too broad a question, but I don't know if anyone would like to try and answer.
That's a big question there, Anna, and it's not an easy one to answer. I mean, I think famously Austen said herself that she was creating this heroine that no one but herself would much like. And it's been interesting. I too have been teaching Emma to my undergraduates at Southampton, and I think there are a few of them here too. And we've been talking in our seminars about whether they do like Emma, which of course is to a great extent not the point. And when we look at I should give a shout out here to the Cardiff database of production and reception, which I get my students to use all the time. And I know it was Anthony who designed it, where you can look up reviews of Austen's work. And I always get my students to do that. And on the Future Learn Austen course, we get them to use that database too. And I think it's interesting the extent to which those first readers and reviewers don't engage with the characters in the way that perhaps we would want them to, in that they seem to read them more as stock characters than we do. We see them in E.M. Forster's terms as round characters, and the first readers did not. So yeah, I mean, I don't want to go on for much longer than that, but I think, yeah, big question. The other two should try and tackle it.
Well, this is slightly different from what Jillian is saying. Thinking about things from Austen's perspective, and for me, she's writing for a kind of a home audience. And she, for instance, she doesn't drop Latinisms. She doesn't make these overt allusions to Ovid, for instance. she sort of domesticates her tale, I think, for readers who might be like her but have not the advantage of education that she had. So that's, for me, based on this sort of style of Emma, that's who the novel is addressed to.
Yeah, just picking up on what Mariam just said, I think the other thing, of course, that Austen does, thinking about that network of readers, is she collects opinions, as she calls them, of Mansfield Park and Emma. And when people are critical, she's not having any of it. You know, she knows the kind of the quality of her work, and she is, you know, again, going back to the correspondence as well as, you know, her novels, she's able to pick out elements of the works that she reads. So, for instance, with Walter Scott, she says, you know, the idea is that Scott publishes anonymously. It's a big secret, but everyone knows who the great unknown, as he was called, is. And she says, sort of around the time that the Scott starts publishing fiction, you know, Walter Scott's got no business to write novels. He's got fame and profit. You know, he's well off as it is as a well-regarded poet. Why is he coming into fiction? And you know, she was prescient in some ways, because Scott's appearance makes the novel a legitimate form for male writers to take on. And in fact, the decade after Austen is publishing, the 1820s sees a switch from women dominating the novel market to men dominating the novel market, and that continues to grow, obviously, into the 19th century. And you know, Austen is painfully aware of how fragile and compromised the position is for women writers, in particularly women novelists, in so many ways, both within the public sphere. You know, it's you know, unwomanlike or unladylike to publish fiction. Even if women were publishing the majority of fiction and reading the majority of fiction, it's seen as still inappropriate by the literary establishment. And yet, and also within circles, you know, she I'm sure she kicked her closest brother Henry a few times, because he went around blabbing to everyone who the author of Pride and Prejudice was, quite proudly. And you know, the secret was out. And Austen's not the only writer who fears exposure. And even someone as established as Frances Burney, you know, when she's publishing, you know, her fourth novel, The Wanderer, she's anxious about it being called, you know, sorry, Camilla, her third novel, being called a novel. And then when she publishes The Wanderer, she's anxious about you know, that novel, which comes out about the same time as Mansfield Park, about the novel going out and sort of being perceived as a novel. So even really successful, well-regarded writers, you know, like Burney, were concerned that their novels were being called novels. You know, they kind of came up with euphemisms for them. And so I think Austen is aware of there's quite a perilous strait to steer through if you're a woman writer. And yet at the same time, she has this confidence and exuberance about novel writing. She's not ashamed of being a novel reader. She's not ashamed of being a novel writer. And she's quite disdainful of fiction that she sees in negative ways, but also people who dismiss fiction. You know, that most famously appears in chapter 5 of Northanger Abbey with the defense of the novel, where she sort of has a go at other novelists who criticize novels. So I think that there's a robustness in her position, as well as an awareness of the fragility of being a woman novelist at this time.
Thanks, Anthony. I think we are officially running out of time now, so I am going to have to bring our discussion to a close. The one thing that we haven't mentioned is adaptations that much, and maybe that's something we'll ask our panelists to follow up on what their favourite adaptation is, because I'm sure they all have one, but we won't go into that now. So thank you everyone for joining us this evening. I'd like us to all give a virtual round of applause to our three wonderful speakers who gave us so much to think about. And do check out our website to see future events in Cardiff Book Talk, and also check your email inboxes for a message about how to leave feedback on tonight. These are our first online events, so we really would like to hear what you think, and if you have any comments, we'd be really grateful to hear from you. Our next event is not till February, and that's Richard Gwynn's The Blue Tent, and registration for that will be shared quite soon. Other authors coming up in the Book Talk schedule include Octavia Butler, Anne Quinn, Tyler Keevil, Hilary Mantel, and Virginia Woolf. So lots to look forward to in 2021, I hope. But for now, thank you for all your questions and for joining us tonight. We will be saving the questions that have not been answered and sharing them on our Facebook page. So do look out for that if you want to see the other questions that have prompted thoughts and discussion today. But that's it from us. I'd like to say a huge thank you to our three speakers, Anthony Mandel, Jillian Dao, and Mariam Wassif. And thank you all for coming. Good night.